Muslims. In practice, we simply don't see them. All the moderate Muslims I know are ex-Muslims, or they haven't been to Friday prayers for months or even years. London has just elected a so-called moderate Muslim mayor, Sadiq Khan, who is praised as a moderate, but many have been wondering just how moderate he really is. Khan has banned sexy underwear advertisements from the underground, which is like our subway, our metro. It's one of those other weird cases in which you sort of see feminists and Islam working in tandem, like a sort of unholy alliance. It's very weird. Does he want to make the underground more Sharia compliant? Or is that just a happy circumstance of pandering to feminists? Well, if the outcome looks the same, what's the difference? Sadiq Khan's met with a lot of shady people in his life, and this is also the mayor who is happy. This is the mayor of London. The mayor of London is perfectly happy to show up to segregated rallies where the women have to stand at the back and cover their heads. And he says nothing about it. He says absolutely nothing about it. In one of the great cities of the West, one of the most important, possibly the most important city in the world, women are being forced to sit at the back. We're having segregated public spaces again. And this has crept up on us out of nowhere. I don't want the same thing to happen to the US. This is a mayor who says, by the way, that part and parcel of living in a big city is terrorism. You might be wondering why I'm spending time in America, so much time in America recently, and less time in my native Europe. And that's because I've seen the continent change very dramatically in my 30-odd years on the planet. Britain prides itself on being a nation of immigrants, and to some degree that's certainly true. But Muslim immigration is different. Muslims haven't integrated in the way that other previous waves of immigrants have. In fact, successive generations, in particular the Pakistani community, are getting worse, not better. We're sending hundreds of fighters to ISIS, nearly as many as Belgium, which is a hotbed of jihadism. Part of the problem is our media and our politicians. The idea that you can't criticize somebody or identify a problem or solve a crime properly for fear of being called racist led to 1,400 girls being raped in Rotherham. Sweden, once a bastion of progressive values, a feminist haven, is now the rape capital of Europe. And police there are even banned from putting the ethnicity of alleged rapists on police reports. There's now a Muslim crime wave in Europe. It's a crime wave that politicians don't want to address, law enforcement can't address, and the media is covering up. Just think about how long it takes for any of your news stations or newspapers to mention the M word or the I word after the latest terrorist atrocity. Yet those terrorist attacks, in particular the ones in France and Brussels recently, were committed by a mixture of homegrown terrorists and fake migrants. We're so dumb, our immigration services are so completely incoherent, confused and unable to do their jobs, and our politicians so dishonest, we can't protect our borders and we can't protect ourselves. This is a difficult subject, and one that many Europeans don't want to address for fear of coming across as racist or somehow bigoted. But if we're not honest about the problem, we can't fix it. And now is not the time to worry about being labelled by the left-wing press just because you are justifiably concerned about the changes happening to your communities. As a gay man, I'm not so worried about GDP. I'm not even principally concerned with British sovereignty. I'm worried more about the influx of a culture that wants me dead. We saw that just last week in Orlando in Florida. The biggest, the most senseless, the deadliest and most horrifying mass shooting in American history. And let's be completely clear, and again, this is an uncomfortable thing to address, but this wasn't radical Islam. It wasn't terrorists. It was mainstream Islam that did this. Consider a few statistics if that is off-putting to you or you find that awkward. In a Gallup poll, 1,001 out of 1,001, that's 100% of British Muslims, told pollsters that they found homosexuality to be an unacceptable lifestyle choice. 52% of British Muslims in a later poll said they wanted it made illegal. 39% of British Muslims, this is British Muslims by the way, not Muslims in Syria, this is not Raqqa, this is London, this is 2 streets away from where you live. 39% of them think a woman should always obey her husband. These are regressive attitudes. These are terrifying attitudes for modern liberal capitalist democracies that have fought for decades to give women and minorities the rights that they deserve. This culture is coming into Europe. For hundreds of years, Europe was a mesmerizing and unique place in world culture. It was the pinnacle of art, music, philosophy, history, science, you name it. This is the continent of Hume, Hobbes, Shakespeare, Mozart and Wagner. But something's happened to that continent recently. Something has changed as a result of unaccountable and incompetent globalist bureaucrats. The nature of the continent is changing, and it's becoming defined not by those incredible innovations, but instead by fear. France, the motherland of Berlioz, Cézanne, Debussy, and Monet, now has no-go zones. The police don't enter there. Why? This is what we've allowed to happen to our civilization. This is what we've allowed to happen to our communities. To my mind, this is the single greatest threat to the stability, safety, security, and happiness of you and your family. Britain doesn't need to share this fate. It doesn't need to buy into the suicidal open-door refugee policies of Germany or the no-go zones of France. The UK has a brighter future, or at least it could do if it makes the right decision this week. I was in Orlando last week, the site of the deadliest shooting attack in American history, and it was committed, of course, by a Muslim who hates gays. In my hometown, London, we've elected a mayor, Sadiq Khan, who's called a moderate, but he cozied up to some pretty ugly individuals in the past when he was an advocate and a lawyer. And people are starting to ask questions. They're starting to wonder why the minute he was elected, his wife donned a hijab. Why he's having segregated rallies where women in headscarves are standing behind men. Why he's picking fights with Donald Trump because the presumptive Republican nominee had the audacity to say, maybe America has a Muslim problem. And now Sadiq Khan wants to ban images of women on the tube. He might be doing it in the name of feminism, but it sounds suspiciously like what we've heard from other parts of the world, doesn't it? America is still reeling from the senseless attack in Orlando. What everyone here is asking themselves is, how can we prevent it from happening again? Well, here's one thing we do know. There's no reason to suppose that Muslims in Europe have any higher opinion of gays, women, blacks, Latinos, or any of the rest of us than their counterparts in America. Immigrant used to mean somebody who moved from one country to another to better their chances, to improve the quality of life for them and their family. But the Muslim immigrants in Europe don't seem to want that. They want something different. They want to drag us down to the regressive social attitudes and terrifying religious conservatism of the Middle East. The UK is better than that. The UK, in fact, has always had a better record on being proudly independent, pro-free speech, and pro all of those other great things that made Western civilization a good place to live. Democracy, property rights, freedom of imagination and thought and speech. Much better record than any of its counterparts in Europe. Now's the opportunity for the people of Britain to show it. The people of Britain to protect themselves from a wave of immigrants that do not share their values, and in some cases hold beliefs entirely antithetical to them. I believe that the Brexit campaign in the UK is Britain's best hope. It is Britain's best chance to stem the tide of immigration that threatens our way of life and threatens our most vulnerable. Instead, consider the plight of Europe, which is a continent now flooded with Muslims. There's Sweden, which now has rape numbers that actually do match feminist statistics. It is a country that prides itself on its feminist credentials. And it is perhaps the only place where rape culture in the West actually now exists. Why? Untrammeled immigration from the Middle East. Malmö in Sweden is now the rape capital of Europe, for one very obvious reason. And then there's Germany, where thousands of women were assaulted on the streets after their genius Chancellor Angela Merkel decided to invite millions of refugees across her country's borders. Now those same refugees are violating women's rights, and feminists are going along with it, making excuses for it and covering up for them. In Britain, where I come from, Muslim rape gangs have molested 1,400 young girls in Rotherham, in sort of middle east of England. And the government report, this is not some sort of crazy right-wing conspiracy, the government report said the reason this went on for a decade, for 10 years, was that the government and that the police and various authorities were afraid of seeming Islamophobic, and that the left-wing Labour and feminist politicians didn't want to seem culturally insensitive. And in the process, 1,400 young girls were raped. Every immigrant group seeks a better life for themselves. They move to a new country to try to enjoy the fruits of the civilization they move to, with one exception, and that's Islamic immigration, who seek to create replicas of their own hellhole countries in the places they come to. Islam is the only group that tells its members not, when in Rome, do as the Romans do, but when in Rome, demand benefits and rape people. The situation with regressive social attitudes in Muslim communities in the West is out of control. And your politicians are not talking to you about it. Your journalists are not being honest with you about it. And it is becoming one of the great
underreported on or even completely unreported on scandals of the modern era. These are people who have views that are profoundly antithetical to our own. And you've got a taste in America of what this might look like in Orlando. I went down there straight after this had happened and gave a speech and talked to people down there, and they were sort of mystified by how this could ever have happened in America. And I said, well, it's happening in America because you're going down the same path that we went down in Europe. In Orlando, about 45 minutes drive north, somewhere called Sanford, I think, there's a mosque. And this mosque hosts a guy who said that the compassionate thing to do to fix homosexuality in the US, the compassionate response, was to kill them all. And this is the kind of environment in which Omar Mateen, who killed 50 and maimed another 50 people in the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, was raised. And this is in Florida. In Florida, in the United States. It was amazing to me that America had allowed itself to get into this position. It's getting so bad in Europe that Vlad the Impaler is acquiring something of a folk hero status compared to the people who now are swarming over from the East. Look, I enjoy being abused, consensually. But Muslim immigration is one of the main reasons I left Europe, and am now looking for a home somewhere else. And I advise women to do the same. You see, Europe hasn't solved the refugee crisis, they've just created a new one. Now the people who lived previously in the West are looking for somewhere else to live. And where are the feminists? Well, the feminists aren't focusing on what's happening to women in the Middle East. They're not focusing on what's happening to women when those cultures are injected into our own by politicians without our consent or our agreement. Feminists are complaining about microaggressions, manspreading, mansplaining. They're inventing garbage statistics to try to insinuate that nice, well-brought-up, well-educated people like you are exercising patriarchal control over them. These oppressive conspiracy theories they come up with. The lies they tell about the wage gap. Women don't earn less than men for the same work. It doesn't happen.